Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is the not-so-final chapter of the Friday the 13th beloved horror franchise, and is also a 1984 horror film directed by Joseph Zito, whose name may sound familiar if you're a fan of The Prowler and other pulp movies from the era. This movie, while not the final chapter, almost created a new beginning, as we would see right after this in Friday the 13th 5, but really, I think Friday the 13th 6 is the one that continued from where this movie took off and brought back Jason as a zombie. So yes, this movie ended an era, but started a completely different one. And I have to give respect to Friday the 13th as a franchise for doing that. For taking a great big swing, a very different shift, and even a shift in tone, yet, in my opinion, especially when it comes to 6 and 8, sticking the landing with this dynamic change-up. Friday the 13th 4, or the final chapter, is often considered by fans to be the best of this franchise. And while I personally don't agree, I can see why. Just from a fundamental standpoint, this is the quintessential Friday the 13th movie. Everything is here. You have the sleaze, you have the tease, you have the mask, you have the music, you have the camp, well, kinda. Everything is here. And it's a smorgasbord. In my opinion, I think the ultimate Friday the 13th movie, whether or not it's my favorite, is part 6. But between this and 6, I think you're getting a pretty good daily dose of Jason. Happy Friday the 13th, by the way. This is my, I can't even say annual. Whenever a Friday the 13th comes around, I am hitting and checking off a new installment of the Friday the 13th series. This is obviously the 4th one I've done. We've covered 1, 2, and 3 before, and now we're on to 3. We are zipping through this franchise, and this is a franchise that is both near and dear to me and to a lot of people. But the thing is, with Friday the 13th, and I've mentioned this before, especially I think in the review for part 1, unlike a majority of horror film franchises where the first one sticks the landing and is the best that the franchise has to offer, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, etc., I don't feel like Friday the 13th acts in the same way. In fact, Friday the 13th is like a fine wine. It gets better with age. It gets better as it goes along in many regards. And case in point, part 4, which, as I mentioned, is a beloved entry in this franchise. I actually took some notes during this movie because there were just so many little details that I hadn't noticed before that I picked up on, which were quite nice to see. Again, I can totally see why so many people enjoy this movie. The characters themselves, the teens specifically, and the family that later become the heroes of this story, feel lived in. They feel like actual people. Early on, there's a scene at the hospital after the previously on Friday the 13th, or the best of kill count at the very beginning, like a montage of, let's take a look back at the history of Friday the 13th with all these gory kills. Then we cut to this hospital. Dude is eating a sandwich while he's signing papers on top of Jason's dead body. And, of course, we immediately get teens making out in the hospital because Friday the 13th. Although, why were dead bodies brought to a hospital? Not entirely sure. That probably should have been a morgue, but I won't take off too many points for it. It's completely fine with me. Friday the 13th did not start with its heavy hitters, and nor has it ever really been a franchise that has gotten to an elite status. Like the classic Halloween movie or Nightmare on Elm Street, as I mentioned before. Those are classic horror movies that still manage to chill today. I don't think anyone is remarking Friday the 13th or any of its sequels in that high of a regard. But this series is just so darn fun, and as soon as you think of the pure genre of horror, it is Jason's iconic hockey mask that solidifies this franchise in horror royalty. There is a great review out there, I'll see if I can find clips for this video, of a Siskel and Ebert review of one of the Friday the 13th movies. Siskel and Ebert, if you don't know, are very famous film critics from the 80s and 90s especially. And they just go on and on ragging about whatever Friday the 13th movie it was, talking about how it's nothing but violence and pure nonsense.
Friday the 13th, the final chapter, is 90 minutes of teenagers being strangled, stabbed, impaled, chopped up, and mutilated. That's all this movie is.
These kids are set up with hopes and ambitions and dreams, and they're just killed off.
So just think of the message this film offers to its teenage audience. The world is a totally evil place, this movie says. It'll kill you. It doesn't matter what your dreams and hopes and ambitions are. It doesn't matter if you have a new boyfriend or a new girlfriend or you've got plans for the future. You can forget those plans because you're going to wind up dead.
And it's true. It's completely true. They're 100% right. But I don't care. Because, what? You're going to fault us for this? This franchise, each of these movies, is more or less a rinse and repeat of the movie before it. Sometimes they're better, sometimes they're worse, but it always sets up kids, somewhat likable kids, and then they're killed. They have futures, they have dreams and ambitions, they have relationships, and they just die. And maybe there is a sadistic bleakness to it that I think a morbidly curious audience enjoys, such as myself. Just the notion that at any point, a complete psycho wearing a hockey mask could just come out and kill you. There's something bizarrely entertaining about it. I don't know. Again, this is kind of the sleaze genre of horror that we're diving into. It's borderline schlock. In some ways it is. But maybe it's not taken to that degree by, for one thing, I think the performances in this movie are very solid. Corey Feldman stands out as Tommy Jarvis, who would be kind of the final guy of this franchise, at least for this movie, 5 and 6. The most attached character we get other than Jason and his mother, which is telling. But we also get a lot of these other kids that wind up being the body count. But one in particular, why can't I remember the actor's name? It's really gonna bug me. Crispin Glover. What a name and what a guy. When Crispin Glover is doing his dance moves with the one like twin girl, it's just cinema. I mean, what are you gonna say? That is pure cinema. And there are so many other great scenes from this movie that stand out in my mind. When Corey Feldman is seeing the girl undressing in the other window and he starts slamming himself on the bed. Oh my gosh, that's great. What else? Oh, Jason kills this girl, the hitchhiking girl, and she's holding a banana. And instead of showing the kill, it just shows her squeezing the banana until the banana pops out. What? Oh my gosh. There are, my gosh. There are also, like, multiple. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount. I think even Dead Meat picked up on this. There are a multiple amount of slow-mo shots of people jumping through windows that shatter. I don't know if Joseph Zito just thought that was a really cool thing, or if they just ran out of ideas, but it happens multiple times, so much so that the dog jumps through the window in slow motion. This movie is something else, guys. I gotta tell ya. And there are just weird things that happen in this movie. I don't know if the version I watched was like the TV edit that cuts out gore, which, by the way, for gore's sake, Tom Savini always kills it with his effects, and this movie is no exception. There's a kill at the beginning of the movie with a hacksaw in the hospital. Very grisly. In fact, I was going to see this movie at a local theater years back, And I turned down the offer from my friend Jared at the time because I watched that clip on YouTube and I said, I don't know if I can see this. This was before I saw all the movies and have become a big fan. But I saw that kill and I said, no way, man. That looks far too intense for me. Man, I'm really ticked at myself for not seeing this movie in theaters. That would have been fantastic. But I digress. Point is, the effects are awesome. And Jason himself looks really cool. You can tell that there are even nods to Savini's work in this movie through the character of Tommy Jarvis. Tommy does makeup and makes Halloween masks, and that comes into play with the plot. You have this nice little setup and payoff with that. It's the closest thing we have to a legitimate, like, story progression in this movie, other than people just being killed randomly. And speaking of the kills, I was trying to get on this point earlier, there are weird fades from certain kills. The one girl swims out to the raft, right? And she's on it, and Jason starts killing her, and it just, like, quickly dissolve fades into the next scene. I don't know if there was a kill there that got cut, or if it was just pure laziness, or they just were like, you know, screw it, move on to the next scene. I have no idea, but it's great. This series is notorious for doing stuff like that, and you really just have to give kudos for them being so ballsy to just say, screw it, we're moving on. One thing I will say, though, that is a praise that I can give to both this movie and this entire franchise, really, is that the location scouts, the places they picked for these movies, is seriously on point. When I'm watching these movies, I feel like I'm at summer camp or at some remote foresty area. No matter what time of year, I always can get in that mindset because these locations write themselves, basically, and they are filled with places where the killer can hide. And speaking of the killer, speaking of Jason, I have maybe my biggest criticism of this movie and 3. Both of these movies, but this one really does it. This one just, you know, puts the nail in the coffin. This movie barely shows the killer. Barely shows Jason. I understand why they did that in the first movie, because it's basically a murder mystery, when you think about it. That it's, you know, Jason's mother. Spoilers. And I understand why they do it in 5, and we'll talk about that mystery when we get there next Friday the 13th. Stay tuned for that one. That's going to be fun. Enchiladas. But when you think about this movie and the previous one, Jason was confirmed as the killer in part 2. And reaffirmed in 3. There's no reason why he should be hidden in this movie at all. There's no twist ending. There's no mystery. It's Jason, and it's been Jason for 3 movies now. Why can't we see him? You know, it's great to see him at the end, but I'd like to see more of Jason in what is essentially the Jason movie. You know what I mean? So, there is that. That's probably my biggest complaint of the movie, and I think that's a warranted complaint because I want to see my boy Jason doing Jason-y things, and not just seeing hands in front of the camera that feels like a PS2 game. Finally, I think I'll end with the fact that it was just reaffirmed to me in this movie. Sorry, I was looking at my notes on my phone because I had all of these notes to share with you about my last watch through of this movie in preparation for Friday the 13th. But it was just reaffirmed to me that unlike all of the other slasher goons, Michael, who really takes his time, Freddy with these creative, weird kills, even Candyman, who has this psychological motif, Jason's just so effective. To the point where it almost isn't even artistic or, you know, trying to be like a creative kill. He just, like, straight up slams people's faces and just stabs them repeatedly until they die. There's no grace to it. He just does it. He's just efficient at it. And I don't even know if that's a praise or a criticism. It's just kind of a factual statement. He just is an efficient killer. I believe I read somewhere that Jason has killed more people than all of the other slashers, and it really makes sense. This man is insane. And after he dies at the end of this movie, spoilers, but it's the final chapter, he comes back as a zombie, only to kill even more people. You shouldn't have killed his mom, guys. You shouldn't have killed his mom. All of that to say, Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Is it the final chapter? No. Is it the best of these movies? In my humble opinion, it isn't, but I could see why a lot of fans consider it to be. I would probably give this movie a 3.5 out of 5 skulls, and for your viewing pleasure, please consider watching either this movie or any of the Friday the 13th movies on Friday the 13th. Remember, for all things Halloween, this is hauntformer.